I will give some questions to the speakers, but open up the chance for your questions as well. My first question is just to continue on the topic. Why most observers are here are probably due to internet voting, and I guess we already heard Liisa's opinion on Madame Chigane's question from Odir on whether other countries should use internet voting or what are the conditions under which internet voting should be started or considered. But I would like to hear the opinion of other speakers as well. What could we suggest? Many countries are considering introducing internet voting or e-voting. Is there one easy solution or one easy answer or not? Who would like to start?
Okay, I'll start. So we get a lot of visitors, indeed, who are interested in our internet voting system. And this is the question that they always ask, of course. And from our point of view, from election administration's point of view, we need to have internet voting that is secure enough that it will withstand not just suspicions, but also complaints, and that we can prove that we do internet voting legally and fairly. And I will repeat what Liisa said before. So for that you have to have a solid foundation, and two of the most important things are digital identity and vote registration. And a lot of countries indeed are interested in internet voting before they have actually solved these two first tasks.
Okay, I will add a few thoughts. Well, nothing much new to say though, because the basics are already mentioned. But since I worked in quite many countries, especially in the Eastern Europe, where I always get the same question like, oh, we like you Estonians, you have internet voting, so we want to have it as well. Then I get political parties asking about it, telling me that we want to use it in our election campaign. We want to tell people that we will introduce internet voting in our country. And every time I have to give an hour lecture to them to tell them why not to do it, because they will surely fail because the countries are not ready. And I think, well, one thing is if you have the kind of ecosystem that helps to build it up, that was mentioned before. But I think another angle that needs to be discussed is also the overall transparency of the state system, because this is where the trust starts. And if, for example, the corruption level of a country is very high, or media is owned by oligarchs, then I would say it's absolutely impossible to build a trust towards internet voting at all. So I would say in these societies that are on that kind of developments situation, they first need to, let's say, clean it up and then start building on that. But of course, these things can happen in parallel because digital society gives you more transparency, and transparency helps you to build more trust. So.
Yeah, Mihkel.
But if I want to jump in on that comment as well, but I agree that transparency is very important. I mean, there has been a conscious decision here in Estonia to make it transparent, but at the same time, of course, you make it transparent with the hope that this will actually mitigate potential criticism, but it opens up new ways to sort of criticize the system at the same time, which I think partially has been happening here as well, because what is always hard to communicate to those political actors is that it's perfectly normal that internet voting or any other different voting channels will produce different results. It doesn't really matter because the overall election outcome matters. We know that voters differ, so they are most likely using different channels as well. And if you look at those channels separately, you might get a different election outcome by channel, which doesn't really matter because in the end it simply matters that they vote and the overall outcome is there. If you are so transparent as, for example, here is the case, you can look at these election results so according to the channels, you start to see that, wait a minute, certain parties seem to benefit, and that is an automatic trigger to at least some political parties maybe or forces to try to undermine it because, I mean, always everyone asks who benefits, and if they think that the opposite side benefits, then that potentially will be used. So I would say transparency is important, but in a combination with high trust. So how to build trust into something that isn't there yet, that's the key question, but probably a situation where there is not like solid trust in election organizers by the population is not a good setting where to experiment with this.
Yes, Lisa, please.
And I think with technology, transparency is necessary but not sufficient, because most citizens are not equipped to, even when use of technology is completely transparent, are not equipped to sort of read it, so to say. So I think when it comes to technology, in addition to transparency, you have to look at the explainability. And whether explainability is, in terms of procedures and in terms of checks and in terms of where technical trust happens, or whether it's in terms of being able to work backwards from an outcome to explain the process by which you got to it, explainability is almost more important than transparency. And secondly, when introducing technology to elections, there's a great case to be made to introduce it not in national binding elections, but rather in something smaller. So whether it's public consultations to exactly build trust, or whether it's non-binding type of elections, non-national elections, or whether it's targeting particular populations that would otherwise be barred from voting because of a very high cost on voting, let's say dispersed rural populations. So starting small also makes sense.
Yeah, please.
Well, and I want to add perhaps that, well, in terms of kind of building up or implementing this kind of system of internet voting, like Estonia had a very particular sequence in terms of which the things developed. So the core for this system, the digital identity, was kind of built or established, well, from today's perspective, in the very early days of the internet, and without much of public debate over it. So it was something which was done, I would say, top-down on the political level, and this didn't really kind of cause much debate or controversy in the public. I mean, if you would try to do something like this somewhere else, back then or currently, let's say in some other country, you would see a lot of public controversy because this kind of digital identity will surely kind of raise suspicions for some parts of the people. So this is also what's there's no answer here. There's simply kind of, let's say, an explanation of why this became possible and eventually so popular in Estonia. Because by the time, that kind of, let's say, the technology was ripe for voting, and by the time it started to build up, people had been using the same identity for all those other kinds of things already. It had already been there for a long time, and then they, at one point, simply realized that, okay, in addition to going to my online bank, I can also vote, and there was not much of a problem over it. So it kind of grew on people slowly over a long period of time after having been first kind of implemented top-down in a way that I don't see would be possible in many other contexts.
Yes. Well, what I have heard from different countries who are considering introducing internet voting is that they think that if the level of trust in election management bodies isn't very high, then the internet voting could build up on that trust. And as Lisa said, some not so important issues put on, let's say, referendum or something, non-binding referendums could help build trust in internet voting. But how do you see, does internet voting in general lead to more conspiracy theories and lead to some, let's say, decrease of trust in internet voting or election management? Or are these two different questions?
Yeah, well, there are lots of fun stories out there. Like I call them the flat earth movements that are creating these kind of stories. But I guess it's harder to create those why it's not safe versions in Estonia, because we have the habits already. But if you go elsewhere, then of course it's there's this big distrust that information can be stolen, data can be misused, and especially maybe in those countries where the trust of any kind of state body is very low. But one example from Estonia, maybe it's interesting to hear what's happening in Estonian polling stations. I think, well, these are, of course, the EKRE voters who are spreading this information, but there was online a text when one person said that, I went to the polling station to pre-vote on paper, and then they wanted to use my ID card to use the chip to put in a computer machine, into the computer to read my data. And this is very dangerous. Do not allow them to do that, because they will steal your identification. Just show it to them and ask them to type in hand, which is everyone who understands how the system works, just simply stupid. But those people who are very skeptic, they read it and they actually believe it, because they go to an election professional who is taking the card, who anyway, the state anyway has the data and what's on your ID card. So there's literally, there's nothing to be stolen. But these kind of stories to those people of low level of trust actually work, unfortunately.
And this is because, for the average voter, internet voting will always be like a black box. Yeah. You push a button, and then suddenly the composition of the parliament appears, and you have no way of understanding what happens in the middle. So in that sense, I would say that this internet voting is inherently less trustable for the average voter than paper voting, where they actually know that, okay, my vote here is on this actual piece of paper, it is in that box, it is counted by physical people, and I can at least imagine how my vote gets counted and enters the system. But this online black box, the average voter will never, and the average person, even the technologically savvy person, will not understand how it actually works.
And I like that we're working up to Mikael, who actually has done proper research on the issue. But I think there's a couple of things at play. One is that, that no voter sits inside of a ballot box at the polling station either. So there's some sort of trust the process to work even in elections. And we have to be as transparent and as good as possible in explaining it. Secondly, there always will be conspiracy theorists. There are people who will sail to the end of the earth and expect to fall off. And research shows that regardless of an issue, that's about 15% of the population. That's the people who are not vaccinated. That's the people who think that the moon landing never happened. That's the people who think that, you know, this is a government's nifty way of stealing their identity. And thirdly, I think where Estonia is unique, especially compared to big federal governments, is that for us, and I apologize to the ladies, an independent Estonia is a fucking miracle. And what that means is that, you know, in 30 years of independence, having transparent democratic governance matters so much that we're not particularly bothered in what domain it happens. And that's very different from, let's say, in Germany, where there's very clear understanding that anything federal is less trusted. Anything digital is less trusted. Whereas in Estonia, we're not domain specific in how we trust our government. We're more looking in terms of convenience and in terms of effectiveness.
Yeah, if to add to that, I mean, trust is very hard to build, very easy to destroy. And if you look at the whole distribution of voters in terms of trust, I mean, they are very different in their opinions, and the same solution might actually cause pretty different things depending on where do they sit. For example, I mean, yes, it's a black box to an average voter, but as Lisa was saying, I mean, it's probably the same holds for partially for paper voting as well, because I mean, you've seen examples where votes are recounted and the outcome is different every time that happens for the same bunch of votes, because it's not so easy. I mean, handwriting and whatnot. So use a bit different types of procedures, the outcome will be different. So how is that a better understandable process? Probably not. But the ways how to increase then this trust, which is hard to increase but easy to destroy. Simple technology, not simple, okay, let's say technological applications that should do that. For example, in the Estonian case, this verification, which Lisa mentioned, might have very different causes in different voter groups. I mean, this might be, and we see from the data, paradoxically, this is actually being used by people who already are more trusting. So they simply do it as an additional verification and they're okay with the process. But at the same time, and this seems to be a cultural sort of contextual thing between different countries as well, this application doesn't reach these people who have a problem of trust, actually. They will never vote via the internet, and if they do, they won't verify. So they're not exposed to this technology that should maybe increase trust a bit. And I presume that that holds for different cultural and country contexts as well. I mean, a colleague from Greece said that, I mean, I told him about the verification application, which is supposed to increase trust. You verify with an independent device, yes, it works, it's good. He said that in Greece that would bring the opposite effect. People start to ask the question, wait a minute, why do I need to verify? Is there something wrong with the system? Why do I need to check? The same piece of technology would probably have different outcomes. So that's very contextual.
Yes, Annika.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, listening to you, I just remembered a few of the examples that I usually bring to those people who, out of Estonia, tell me that, you know, what you have in Estonia could never happen here because you can't trust anything that's online. Then I usually tell them two stories. So one is that I ask them to look towards Russia and just think for a second, how is it possible that Putin's party is always getting somewhere around, I don't know, 85, 90% of the votes? And another thing is that everything on paper cannot be traceable, but everything that happens online is traceable. You leave a mark. So therefore, changing a paper on a ballot box is actually way more easier, and it has happened for years and years before. It's not like a CI movie when, you know, those detectives come and start dusting the paper, finding the fingerprints. It's impossible. It usually doesn't happen. So therefore, overall, it is way more safer. But of course, these are just simplified examples just to have a discussion to make them think that it could be possible, but still a long way to go.
Okay. No one discussed the issue of financial reason, why to use or not use internet voting. I guess all the technological side is quite costly, and I think in Estonia, after we introduced the internet voting, it has come out that it's rather high number of financing we have to put into the system. But in larger countries, it would be a bit cheaper, or let's say compared to paper voting in polling stations. How do you see whether it would be advisable for larger countries to use internet voting because it might be, let's say, cheaper for them to set up all the technical conditions? I'm not talking about Russia, who's using internet voting, but we don't know more about it.
And if you don't have democratic voting, then it doesn't matter, as I said before. But I mean, voting at the polling station on paper is not free either. And it's hard to quantify the difference in Estonia because of the reliance on the ecosystem. So, the identity scheme is in place, the domain monitoring is in place. There's work that the group led by Robert Grimmer did at Caltech a couple of years ago, which basically said that online voting during online voting period is the cheapest way, and predictably, having the ballot delivered to someone who's unable to go and vote at the polling station is the most expensive. And their modeling, if I remember correctly, showed that the price difference is about 15-fold. So the price of a vote cost in using online voting is about 15 times cheaper than the price of a vote cost when you have your ballot box delivered to you. And then other methods are in between. And that's in Estonia.
Yeah, Mikael.
Yeah, but Arne probably is the person who can give actual maybe numbers, but here we have two parallel systems, and paper voting obviously is in place still as well. So overall, actually, you're probably not able to save too much because you need to run stuff in parallel. But if you look, for example, a very interesting case, Canada, quite many municipalities in the province of Ontario and Nova Scotia in local elections have discontinued paper voting and have only internet voting, partially due to cost reasons, because it's actually simply cheaper to run. But that probably isn't the recipe for other places because, if you look at what happened here in Estonia, at least initially, that would mean that a certain segment of voters will simply not be able to vote. So this is not probably the place where to save costs, essentially. But it's happening over there to a relatively large degree, actually.
Yeah, I will add that internet voting has become the cheapest method because of the scale. So per vote, it is the cheapest because there are so many internet votes. But of course, you have to, if we talk about the costs, then this whole processes that preceded internet voting, like the rollout of ID cards and creation of the population register, these were big undertakings and were very expensive at the time. Another aspect that sometimes is mentioned is that voters themselves also save time and money. So this can be actually quite a big bonus for the voters themselves. So it can be depending on the system that the voters need to queue up and vote. In Estonia, though, voters find it unacceptable anyway. So we have enough polling stations to cover these needs. But I think Mikael's research showed that if it takes more than 30 minutes to go to vote and back, then this is the turning point where the voters will start preferring internet voting.
I think it also can be a little bit of a generational issue. which kind of voting to choose, because, well, firstly, it struck me before that you're talking about paper voting here. I realized I don't even know anymore how it happens, because it's exactly 20 years ago when I last voted on paper. So I have no idea what's going on inside of the polling station, because I don't have any need to go there. But my daughter, she's turning 18 in August, so she can't vote on these elections. But in Estonia, you can vote when you're 16 on local elections. She did vote on last local elections, first time in her life, of course online, because her parents are voting online and this is a normal thing to do. So I tried to explain her that there's another way, and she just couldn't get it. What do you mean? You just have to walk somewhere and you take a paper and vote. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. So I think it could be also that there could be a change also in Estonia towards more choosing online, when those people who are born into this society that we have today don't know the other option at all.
Yeah, Lisa.
But you sort of follow up on that. I think it's also very important, and that's advice that, again, we all take from Mihkel's research, is that just by having a new method of voting available doesn't increase turnout. So, the 18 or 16 to 26-year-olds are the least likely to vote regardless of the way they can vote in, which means that even if you introduce this new, possibly more accessible ways of voting, outreach has to be on top of that. And by the way, I just checked online. We've crossed the 300,000 online votes line with a half an hour remaining. So my money is on about 310, 315,000 online votes this year.
Okay, yeah. But of course, there are still some voters who want to have the election day as a fest, or celebrate this day and then go to polling stations on Sunday. But the number of voters is always decreasing, and it's almost like 50% turnout right now. It's like 47% now, and then still increasing today. But let's see how many will come to the polling stations tomorrow. Maybe one more question concerning internet voting. We don't have much time left, but the issue of vote secrecy. I know many people around the world consider that vote secrecy is an obligation also for the voters. They are not allowed to publish their preference, and online voting can't protect in any way the possibility for voters to show their preference to family members or someone else. How do you see whether vote secrecy is going through some kind of let's say, new forms, or should it be an issue in discussing the possibility of introducing internet voting in other countries?
If I may, I would say this obviously places a bigger responsibility on the voter to keep his or her vote secret, basically. So the voter needs to be a bit more conscious about it, and obviously be better at cyber hygiene, etc., but simply also physically, let's say, protecting it a bit more. So it becomes more essentially a duty, but at the same time, by definition, then also actually a choice whether to keep it secret or not. And I would say there's a paradox here, because if you look at voting behavior research starting from, in the US after the Second World War, when we started to really do large-scale, let's say, survey research, classic American voting studies started to show, and this has been repeated across the board in almost all countries. Voting is a social activity, actually. People don't keep their votes secret within the family, definitely not. And when the political choices and the votes are being discussed, this actually increases turnout within the family as well. So it makes turning out more likely if you discuss your political choices. Yes, but in the polling station, that's something else, but actually within this family nucleus, this is not really kept a secret. What internet voting obviously does is it makes publishing your vote much more easier. At the same time, I mean, it should come with a bigger responsibility to keep it a secret as well. But it's still being discussed, so people are social beings, so we cannot really do much about it. But it increases these potential risks. But with potential risks comes bigger responsibility.
And it's also important when you're introducing different ways of voting, that the vote secrecy preserving mechanisms match the method of voting. So, we already discussed the double digital envelope, which preserves the secrecy and the privacy of the vote digitally. But similarly, if you're remotely voting, regardless of what the remote voting method it is, whether it's mail or whether it's online, that you cannot control for the environment, which means that you do have a higher risk of voter coercion and vote buying. And what Estonia has done to de-incentivize voter coercion is that you can recast your online vote and only the latest vote will count, which de-incentivizes coercion. And you can then also cast a vote on election day, and that will overwrite that will cancel your digital votes. So it's very different from preserving the privacy of the voting booth, but it is vote secrecy preserving mechanism.
Yeah, I fully agree that the secrecy should be kind of self-evident, that yes, if you want to keep it a secret, and also for security reasons, it needs to be like that. But at the same time, I think it's important that we can choose if we want to share it publicly, because I look at it from a totally other angle, from the angle of having a healthy society where citizens are more connected and more engaged and taking responsibility. And therefore, I believe letting everyone know who do I vote for or who's my favorite also kind of builds that up. But there's also a risk. I know families who do not talk to each other anymore, or there could be a relatives party where you realize that, oh my God, my uncle is voting for Ekre. And then this will be a huge mess. So I guess there are like positives and negatives in it, but overall I think it should be a choice of a citizen.
But no one touched upon on the issue of most vulnerable groups, or let's say elderly people, or people who are not well aware of what's going on, and by using internet voting, remote voting, maybe in general, it's more easy to manipulate at least, let's say, 0.5% or 0.25% of votes without the full understanding of those voters under whose name the vote is given.
I mean, it's the granny farming hypothesis. Basically, that there's a group of elderly people whose digital identities have been compromised by gathering their cards. But as far as I'm aware, and Arne, and in fact you are better to address the complaints from recent years, there hasn't been evidence of that happening with that, social and care institutions or otherwise on a scale. And frankly, thinking like the attacker, if I was criminally minded and had access to someone else's digital identity, stealing a vote, again, if I was criminally minded, stealing a vote, of course, is fun, but with the same digital identity, I could also steal their assets. Now, what's the incentive to steal the vote if you could be stealing the assets?
Yeah, I would steal money. That's more practical.
Yeah. So, some questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Just maybe a little bit philosophical question. So I would like to say 20 years ago, Estonians were they had a great courage to start this e-voting procedure. If you had to start today, maybe the question goes to all of you, just the answer is a one word. If you should start today, would that be demand of society or ambition of the nation, e-voting? Thank you. Demand or ambition, if today you had to start e-voting?
Who wants to answer?
From my point of view, internet voting is so ingrained in the society right now, and it is so such an integral part of the whole ecosystem of government services. So I think that there would be demand at this point anyway, and I think in Estonia's case, it wouldn't be that controversial to introduce internet voting. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, demand, because if state services don't work properly, maybe there's some hiccup somewhere, we get very mad. It's like you're used to everything working smoothly. So if someone would tell me today that I would have to take that 45 minutes and go vote on paper, I would be like, no. And I've been lazy. My ID card, by the way, gets over the due date tomorrow. So I ordered new one 3 days ago, but I'm getting new one on Monday, meaning that all my digital signature applications will stop working tomorrow. I'm already worried how I'm going to cope these 12 hours. So I guess this is just an example how addicted we are already that these things work. So yeah, demand.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's hard to disagree here. So if you take only internet voting out of the picture, and if you consider that people do all their other dealings with the government basically online, or there are many people who do, then yeah, I mean, people would not accept not being able to vote somehow online as well. I mean, for example, I don't think I've ever been to a government office doing anything physically, ever. So yeah. Well.
I think there's a close to a consensus on this stage, but it shouldn't be at the cost of, at this point, even in Estonia as digital as it is, at the cost of paper voting, but rather it should be an additional way of voting. I don't think we're at the point where we're seriously considering 100% online voting.
Yeah, I mean, probably now there's also, yes, I would say demand, but back in 2005, probably not, because when you think of, and this connects to why there hasn't been an impact on turnout, because voting isn't difficult in Estonia. I mean, this is small, the network of this polling station is very good. I mean, within half an hour you can essentially get to the polling station. So that part of low turnout, or that part of turnout, non-turnout, which is caused by physical difficulty of voting, is very small. So if you introduce internet voting, that sort of addresses this small part. The rest actually don't really care, because the causes of non-turnout are somewhere else, some disillusionment, etc., things like that. So this is not a thing that you can solve with technology. So there wouldn't be demand back in the day in terms of, let's say, we need it in order, otherwise I cannot really vote. But now it's simply convenience, and everyone would like to do it in a convenient way. So demand, but not because of difficulty of voting, but simply for the sake of convenience. But if you think back to 2005, that definitely was a national promotion project, basically number one in the first, so number one in the world. So that was definitely a race back then. Now the situation is, well, completely different.
Maybe just to add, well, we don't allow, as I said, voting on mobile devices. One of the main reasons is a high level of dependence on Google or Apple. If we need some apps in the Google Store or Apple Store, or as well as more difficult, more, let's say, complex and difficult solutions for observing in these cases, as well as both verification by other, let's say, mobile device, which most people don't have. But there's still quite a high level of let's say, voters who complain that, well, why can't I vote over the mobile device because it's more convenient than having a computer or bringing it if I'm going to travel, let's say, during the electoral period. And on the level of low level of bureaucracy in Estonia, you can cut your forest with a registration or permit which is given within 15 seconds on average. Not 15 seconds if you submit that kind of application online. Maybe one more question from the audience. No?
No,
Yes,
people
please.
want to eat.
For the I-voting system, is there anything the panel think could be improved? Because nothing is ever 100% perfect. So what part of the system do you think would be the next step in developing it?
Mobile
I have
voting.
many. I mean, mobile voting already was mentioned, and it's a question of, as Oliver rightfully pointed out, whether that means of voting matches the legal criteria for voting, mostly, including with app stores. We just launched a prototype of a government app for the services. For the Ukrainian colleagues in here, thank you for DIA. It's based on very much on the same approach. So technically that's doable, but it's a question of whether it qualifies for the legal criteria. There's no extending online voting to also to election day, something that citizens often ask about. But then, how do you make sure that you can run both at the same time? So there's many steps like that.
Another idea, actually, I mean, maybe make it more difficult. Because now when this 50% threshold is reached, obviously, probably is within 15 minutes. If you at the same time start to really optimize the paper voting infrastructure, this creates a sudden different risk situation as well. I mean, if something goes wrong, at the moment, it's quite impossible that the whole nation would then go quick and vote on paper. I mean, there have been discussions in the past, like, I mean, this 50% actually is really a threshold. I mean, maybe at least, let's say, a point to think of. Should we then do something a bit differently now? Maybe actually dampen the usage a bit, ask for double identification, whatnot, because let's be honest, I mean, it creates certain risks, and this have now are growing with this 50% as well. It has become too big to fail, essentially.
Yes, thank you for all panelists. Maybe just two concluding words or sentences. We've had approximately 25,000 internet voters during that seminar here. It's almost like 3% of turnout increase during that time. We had discussion here. What you could note from this seminar is not only the issues of internet voting, but also the way campaigning is organized or regulated in Estonia is rather different from the average in Europe. There are almost no limitations or restrictions for campaigning, even on election day. No cost limits on campaigning. Just if it's going too impolite, you can be, let's say, punished or brought against civil court. And then probably you will notice tomorrow when going to the polling stations that there are some candidates in front of the polling stations campaigning still. At the same time, the campaign atmosphere or polarization has been increasing over the years, it is not something we are proud of. We are proud of being high up in the democracy index from both Soviet countries being the highest, but still the campaign atmosphere or polarization, as well as a certain level of Putinism in the society, which has been spreading over the longer period, is still there. No speakers talked about the one political party who's campaigning for Putinist views, but who has very small amount of popularity among the voters. But still, some other parties are still trying to be more polite or soft with what Russia is doing. What you have probably heard or noticed is that the voting period is very long, not just 1 day or 2 days, but full 7 days, which means also some security issues for organizing, let's say, the paper voting, where the ballot boxes are kept, how the secrecy is guaranteed, and it's also a challenge not only to EMBs but also for observers to be present for 7 days if they want to be sure about the legality or secrecy of or security of voting. And you probably also noticed that the seat allocation mechanism, how the votes are calculated to seats, is rather complex for ordinary voters. It is not something they can understand without studying it for at least hours. So a complexity in many parts of the electoral system in Estonia, not only seat allocation mechanism, but also how to observe the internet voting is very complex and very difficult. So the trust issues might be based a lot on the complexity issues as well. Thank you for attending, and now let's go to the dinner tables. Thank you.